I'd like to turn your attention back to the book of James again this morning. James chapter 5 this time. James chapter 5 and verses 7 through 11. James chapter 5 and verses 7 through 11. Be patient, therefore, brethren, unto the coming of the Lord. Behold, the husbandman waiteth for the precious fruit of the earth, and hath long patience for it until he receive the early and latter rain. Be ye also patient, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord draweth nigh. Grudge not one against another, brethren, lest ye be condemned. Behold, the judge standeth before the door. Take, my brethren, the prophets, who have spoken in the name of the Lord, for an example of suffering, affliction, and of patience. Behold, we count them happy which endure. Ye have heard of the patience of Job, and have seen the end of the Lord, that the Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy. I want to focus a little bit of our attention today on this need to press on, to keep going in the battle. So often we can feel discouraged and downhearted, and it seems like life isn't fair, and the devil's attacking us, and all those things. And sometimes we feel almost disheartened to continue on, but we must press on. It's too late in the journey for us to back away or just grow careless or sit by the wayside, but we have to press forward in Him. I've been fascinated by the story of the Sager children from back in the days of the Oregon Trail, and how they and their family were headed west. They were on the Oregon Trail. There were these dreams of finding a place in Oregon, and the father had urged them, and this is what we're supposed to do. I believe maybe he had fallen sick or something. The father did, and he passed away, and he had urged them, you go on to Oregon. The mother passed away as well, and finally there are 7 children that are left as orphans. The oldest of the children there that were left behind was John. He was 13 years old, and he knew that's what his dad had maybe even one of his last requests. You make sure you go on to Oregon. And they traveled along with the wagon train for a little while, but then the group had decided, you know what, I think we're going to head off. We're going to take another course here, apparently a branching of the trails or something, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to go toward California instead of Oregon. Well, John knew that was not his father's expectation for him. And feeling that weight on him, they maybe there's different versions of the story, but I believe they maybe slipped away during the nighttime and left the wagon behind. Of course, they didn't want to make much noise, and they just slipped away, and they headed their way toward Oregon. There's a whole lot to the story. We're not going to take a lot of time there, but John had to press them on. He had to push his siblings. They probably got angry at him, got bitter at him, whatever all, because there was all sorts of hardships. There was treachery. There was loneliness, of course, near starvation. I think there was one of the sisters that ended up with a broken leg. I don't know, an ox stepped on it or something. And then they had also the deep snow of the Rockies. And they just about didn't make it through. Somehow, through that grit and determination, John pushing them along the way, they finally made their way down into the valley again there in Oregon and got to warmer weather, of course. And the Whitman mission was out there, Marcus and Narcissa Whitman, I believe. And they took the children in and nursed them back to health, eventually adopted them. But it all came down to John deciding, we won't stop. We are going to keep going. And we admire such courage and determination. And of course, that's why his story has lived on even till these days. But though our journey spiritually may not be plagued by those same sets of problems, it may be a little different. Sometimes there might be some similarities, but even though they may be a little different than what John and his siblings faced, we also must show courage and determination if we're going to make it in our journey to heaven. We cannot stop short. We cannot back up. We must press forward. The word patience here, sometimes we think of that as referring, or actually it's patient and patience, both used there, but it's the same word in Greek. And when you start looking at that, it's not just a matter of, let's see, watching my clock here. I hope they'll soon get out of the store. I'm tired of waiting. That's not what it's talking about. This is more of an endurance and a pressing forward, even long suffering included in that idea. So we're instructed to keep going and pressing forward when hard times come. I know there may be many temptations to get discouraged. We may grow weary in well-doing, and we're tempted even or feel like we're about to faint in the battle or the journey that we're on. But we must keep the goal in sight. So this morning I want to just kind of point this out to you, and we have the analogy that James uses here in this chapter. Verse number 7, he begins talking about the husbandman that waiteth for the precious fruit. And so you recognize, we think of that maybe as a farmer or even a gardener for that matter. He may not be a full-fledged farmer, but maybe you put out some garden. And even these days are a little bit rough because we're recognizing that the rain has been pretty sparse lately, and we struggle through. We wonder maybe sometimes how much is all that labor going to even bring us in the end. Feel like we just can't keep going. Or at least as we keep going, we're losing more and more, and just looks like it's hopeless. Sometimes maybe we fear that the work will be wasted. But really, in all we know of Scripture and all that God has instructed us in, one thing we can know is that the walk of faith, if we stay true, if we're really faithful to God, it will end in sight, in victory, in blessing. It'll all be worth it after a while. But we have to keep pressing on. James is saying here that the farmer keeps hoping. He's looking toward the harvest. And obviously, as I've mentioned, we must do the same in our spiritual walk. Let's just take a moment here to look at the context, because in the earlier part of this chapter, we read in those first 6 verses, it's really looking rather dismal. He's talking about the rich men. He says, "Go to now, ye rich men, weep and howl for your miseries that shall come upon you." And he goes through and begins talking about how you've been, I guess one way we refer to it as shysters or cheats. You've been unfair with people. You just want to live in pleasure, and you persecute the just. You're not fair with your laborers. These just people, the ones who tried to stay godly, had to somehow try to keep pushing on in spite of all the hardship, in spite of all that these rich men were doing to them. They had to somehow hold on, and it's going to pay off someday. I may not understand it right now. This doesn't seem like the way it should be happening. This is not fair, but somehow we've got to keep pressing on. And then we read too that God was going to come and turn it around for them. And so let's just sort of try to apply this truth to our own hearts in these days for just a few moments here this morning. Let's stir our hearts and minds to press on. We must press on in the battle. For the child of God, there's another day coming, and it'll pay off to stay true. And so let's press on. The first one I want to notice with you, and we're going to use especially verse number 8 as our text here this morning. "Be ye also patient," or again, we might say perseverant, and endure to the end. "Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord draweth nigh." So let's just touch on those 3 right there. The first one we want to notice with you is that we need to endure to the end. Endure to the end. Of course, I just mentioned the meaning, the overall message there of patience that James is urging. But let's just take a little bit more time on that. And really, I know we understand this, we recognize this, but it's not enough just to start well. Really, I'm not a gardener. I've never done very well. A few times I've gotten a few things, but I am not a gardener. But if all it took was starting well, I probably could do all right. I might make a good gardener, a good farmer. Because when springtime comes around and as the weather starts warming up, and it feels like planting season and people starting to get in their garden patches or in the fields, then, boy, it seems like it'd be nice to till some soil. And I've done it before. And get to borrow a tiller or something, and I'll get out there and I'll make the the ground look so good, and I'll start marking off the rows, and I can do all these things. The problem is, that's about as long as it lasts to get the seeds in the ground. But then, those of you that have had gardens or fields where you've tried to plant some things, it's going to take maybe a different variety. Some of you might do different things, but we'll just talk about a little garden plot, and it's going to take getting out there and weeding it. You have to get out there and try to pull those weeds and salvage your soil, your crops in the soil there. Don't want them to be overrun by the weeds. And I confess, once in a while, I've had to mow my garden down with a mower because the weeds had overtaken it. Part of that reason was being away so much during the summer. I didn't have the time or whatever to keep after it like I should have. But really, starting well didn't do me any good if it just gets mowed under after a while. Farming, gardening requires more than just nicely plowed fields in the spring. You have to keep at it. And that's kind of what James is saying here. The husbandman, the farmer, waiteth for the precious fruit of the earth, and hath long patience for it until he receive the early and latter rain. And so that farmer, as he's going through, he's put all this effort into it, and he keeps doing whatever he can. And then he asks the Lord to send the rain. And again, we're at that point. We need to pray for one another. And God will give the rain to those that are still raising crops. But there has to be a harvest later on to make it worthwhile. And really, we could maybe go back to another analogy. Paul sometimes used the analogy, it seemed like in the running or the race aspect. And so you think about a runner, and maybe for a little while, people may feel sorry or halfway embarrassed for that young man, we'll say this, that's running and is lagging behind everybody else. Now, he may be pacing himself, but they might not realize it. And so he just kind of lags behind and just kind of keeps on running. But I've seen even a little video clip of a runner who all of a sudden, after running kind of toward the back of the pack for a while, all of a sudden started taking off. People thought he was crazy. He must have forgot that the race is a little longer than just this next lap. And yet he just kept on running. He just ran away from everybody else. But what matters, however fast you run, however long it takes, what matters is that you cross the finish line, spiritually that is. We understand the runner who wins the race is the one who crosses first. But in the spiritual life, we simply have to succeed and get through to the end. We have to press on, even when it feels difficult, even when we don't think we can make it. We have to keep pressing on. Endure until the end. Jesus said twice in the book of Matthew, his very words. If you have a red letter edition, you may find it that way. Or you would find it that way in Matthew, maybe chapter 10 and another one a little bit later on, where he says something to this effect: he that endures to the end shall be saved. Too many people these days are falling by the wayside. Too many people are losing sight of the goal. They're stopping before they've gotten there. They're backing off. They're sitting by the wayside. They're taking it easy. They're finding an easier way or whatever else it may be. But the race isn't won yet. And we must keep pressing on. Yes, I know the journey may be difficult, and sometimes people may not understand even our chosen course. But our course is chosen by God. And so as He points the way, we obey and we do what He says. And even when it's not easy, we keep pressing on to please Him. We must endure until the end. Our job is to keep pressing onward with the prize in our eyes, the goal in mind. Endure till the end. The second one I would notice with you is there in the middle part of verse number 8. Establish your hearts. And what I'd like to suggest to you this morning is that we need to also encourage ourselves. Now we think about even the story of David. Some of you may be familiar with it, some of you may not be. But way back, as David was still on the run from Saul, he had gone out with the Philistines, was going to help them in battle, apparently, from what we can gather. But they rejected him because the Philistines were afraid he was going to turn on them. So as they go back home, he gets to his home city. His soldiers are with him. They find it burned to the ground. Or maybe in the process of burning even, possibly. But his family, His soldiers' families have been taken captive, and the soldiers were so distressed, they were about ready to kill David. But it tells us this little thought, even when David was in grief on his own, I mean, his own family was gone as well, and now he's facing the treachery of his soldiers, but it says that he encouraged himself in the Lord. And you know, you and I, once in a while, we have to just stop a moment and kind of take stock of where we are and what's going on. James here is continuing on, and even the later verses, verse number 10 in particular, and even then on into verse 11 as well. But he begins talking about the other prophets, including Job. Job was one that's mentioned here, and the different ones who have been afflicted and how they had to keep doing what was right, keep trying to press onward in spite of the struggle that they were in. And then verse number 11 tells us, behold, we count them happy which endure. Happy. We need to encourage ourselves. We can look at others, and we even read the faith chapter there in Hebrews 11, and we think, wow, weren't they great men of God? And just look at what they went through. You know, some of those didn't even come out of it alive. The latter part of Hebrews 11. They didn't even come through it alive, but they did keep pressing on. They did keep doing what they needed to do, and God put them in the Hall of Faith, if I could put it that way. Hall of Fame of faith, if you want to say it that way. So God was pleased, but they had to pick themselves up. And I guess what I'd like us to think about is when we see all these different ones, and Hebrews 12 actually tells us, we have this whole cloud of witnesses that are cheering us on. We need to press on. We need to keep doing what we ought to do, even when it's difficult. We need to encourage ourselves. Maybe I could just simply say that when we feel discouraged and maybe abused, maybe helpless, maybe misused in some way, and it's not been fair, and all those things, maybe we ought to remember the men and women of the faith chapter. Those who already have proven true. Those who have pressed on. And maybe it would encourage us a little bit to recognize, wow, I have not had it as bad as they do. I might have it pretty tough right now. I might not know how I'm going to get through, but I haven't really had to deal with it quite like they have. And we can find strength and courage in the battle. Sometimes we may think of courage as being something more that we have than something we do. You know, so-and-so has courage. And many times we may not feel like we do. But did you know that courage is simply stepping up and doing the right thing with it, no matter what you feel like? But doing the right thing when it's difficult? That's what courage really is. And it takes courage to walk the Christian walk of faith. We have to keep doing what we know we ought to do, even when we don't feel like it. I know the devil certainly makes it his business to try to bring discouragement and hopelessness and have those things cause us to give up. Maybe to feel like it's not worth it anymore. And so we must courageously, take these words here, establish our hearts. Establish your hearts. Say, God, help me to be encouraged. Help me to press on anyway. Help me to have the courage to stay true. Strengthen me. And we can encourage ourselves in the Lord. If necessary, maybe you need to take some spiritual inventory a little bit. Just make sure all is clear. Don't want you just to in either case, we don't want you to be deceived, but also not to be casting away your confidence. And so just take a little inventory, make sure all is right with the Lord. Everything's clear. And then keep your confidence in God. Resist the devil and seek after God. Press toward Him. So we endure to the end. We encourage ourselves. But then also, there's something a little different here at the end. And verse number 8 again. For the coming of the Lord draweth nigh. I'd like to just mention to you that we also ought to be expecting God's intervention. We need to expect God's intervention. I think that one of the tools that the enemy uses is maybe even frustration, maybe some discouragement, the pain over things that don't seem right. It doesn't seem like this should be happening. And then we read that last phrase that I just shared with you. The coming of the Lord draweth nigh. Now, often we would think, well, okay, that means that Christ is returning. He's going to come back for His church. And so that's what we need to focus on. And that very well may be part of it. Maybe that's included. But if you look at the whole context here, I have a feeling that part of what's being referred to is just simply saying God will show up for his people. When you feel like the rich people are abusing you, when you feel like those who have it put together have not really accepted you, when you feel like you're sort of at the bottom of the heap, when you feel like the troubles of life have just overwhelmed you, don't forget that God hasn't forgotten you. The coming of the Lord draweth nigh. Throughout Scripture, there are different places. I believe it's Joel refers especially to the day of the Lord, but sometimes it might refer to the coming of the Lord. And that's not necessarily just referring to how he's going to come in glory, which we welcome that, and that's a wonderful hope for the Christian. But it's also wonderful to recognize that even before that ultimate returning glory, God may return even to our situation, to our lives, and help us in the midst of trying circumstances. He'll set the record straight. He'll come through and meet our need. He can correct the wrongs done to his people. He knows all about them. He hasn't forgotten what's going on. Not one thing has escaped his notice. Again, remember the context. We've just been in those previous verses 1 through 6. We can read that the people of God were oppressed. And yet God was going to step in. God was going to come through. God has promised not to give us more than we can bear. And so we need to keep courage when it seems like he's delayed in his response. When the attacks against us, when the unfairness seem to be overwhelming. When we don't know how we're going to keep going. Could I just remind you of a scripture? I know maybe this even seems out in left field sort of, but don't forget that Paul tells us in Galatians 6 and verse 7, whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. And so any that are trying to hinder the work of God, any that are trying to disrupt the cause of Christ, even in your own life, maybe they're trying to hinder you in your testimony, your walk with God, don't forget that there's coming a time of reaping. We've already had that coming through here in the idea of the husbandman. There will be a reaping. God will step in. God will come through. He will intervene in the affairs of life. We're doing our best to please him. If everything in our heart is just responding to him properly, we're obeying, we're minding him, we're trying to keep the right spirit in the midst of suffering, he will come through for us. Sometimes it might seem like a long wait, but expect God to step in. Endure to the end. In spite of trials, in spite of hardship. Encourage yourself in the meantime. Pick yourself up. Trust God more fully. Keep courage. And then expect God to intervene. He will come through. Yes, sometimes it seems, even in verse number 7 there, he's talking about waiting, having long patience, waiting for the early and latter rain. We've been waiting for rain, a good soaking rain, really. But when it seems like that's delayed, and maybe we feel, I'm talking about more so in a figurative sense now, but when we feel a little bit like giving up, when we wonder where God is or why he hasn't come through, why he hasn't brought the harvest, why it's not all worked out just maybe quite like we had hoped. Could I just encourage you with the words of a song from, a number of years ago? It's actually in our book, the dark blue book. Press right on. Don't you look back. Press right on. Now is not the time to back off or change course. But like Paul, we need to have a testimony that says, I press toward the mark for the prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. The Lord, actually, down in verse number 11, I'll just kind of leave that with you. The Lord is very pitiful. Or maybe we might think of it as piteous, or he cares for us. He shows pity toward us, and of tender mercy. He's still the one we serve. He still knows all about the heartache and the pain. He's listening for our cry, and he will answer. Press right on. Don't you look back. Just press right on.